Why did the most decorated communications operative on base stand frozen in a conference room, her fingers trembling at the buttons of her uniform, while a general called her a liar? The word had not been shouted. It hadn't needed to be. It lived in the curl of his lip, in the way he said excuse, in the cold certainty of a man who believed he had seen all forms of weakness and could smell another one. Sergeant Maya Reeves stood at attention in Colonel Marcus Kine's office, shoulders square, chin lifted, heart pounding so hard she felt it against the fragments buried inside her chest. She was 27, peak physical condition on paper, commendations in tactical communications, flawless performance reviews, and apparently a fraud. Talman Valley. He said it like it was a footnote. Like it was a lazy story she dusted off when headaches became inconvenient. An accident from 4 years ago, he had asked. But there was something he hadn't seen, something she had never allowed anyone to see. 4 years earlier, at 3:14 hours, the desert had turned into fire. The migraine always came at the same time, 03:14, like her body kept its own memorial clock. She would wake in darkness, hands crushing her temples, breath trapped between scream and discipline. The pain wasn't abstract. It was mechanical, metal grinding against nerve. 32 fragments of artillery shell shifting inside muscle that would never fully heal. She never told anyone about the exact second the pain began. She told Corporal Jennifer Dawson it was a stomach bug. She told the medic she was dehydrated. She told herself she could endure. Ignore that was easier. On Red Mesa Base, the desert sun burned everything clean by mid-morning. No one saw weakness under that light. Maya led 5-mile runs with steady cadence. She trained Private Marcus Webb on encrypted burst transmissions as if nothing in her body screamed. 12 seconds in combat is a lifetime, she'd told him. She knew because she had lived 12 seconds too long. When the IED detonated in Talman Valley, 3 soldiers died instantly. Corporal James Hunt, Specialist Lisa Orozco, Private First Class Anton Vyulov. She remembered the smell of burning rubber, the sound of her own lungs trying to inflate through blood. She remembered assessing her injuries the way she'd been trained. Penetration wounds, multiple, can't feel left side fully, still conscious, radio intact. Crawl. She had crawled 20 meters through sand thick with debris and fuel. Crawled while fragments shifted deeper. Crawled because 5 others were still alive, and she was the only one who could encrypt a transmission under fire. She never told anyone how close she came to giving up, how one thought echoed louder than duty. Just lie down. But she didn't. She encrypted, sent coordinates, confirmed medevac inbound, then darkness. 15% survival rate. The doctors later said at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. She never used that statistic as armor. She used silence instead. So when Colonel Kine stood before her with 30 years of service in his spine and medals lining his wall, and asked what injuries looked like, she felt something break. Or maybe something finally decided to stand. "You want proof, sir?" Her fingers moved to the first button. There is a specific kind of fear when you expose not your body, but your truth. By the time the 4th button came undone, his voice had lost its steel. The scars caught fluorescent light like a map of violence, twisted tissue over ribs, surgical lines, dimpled skin where fragments remained too close to arteries to extract. "Entry wound," she said calmly, touching one. "Fragment 3.2 centimeters, 2 millimeters from my heart." Her voice did not shake. Inside she was unraveling. Dr. Rebecca Palmer entered with a medical file thick as history. CT scans, photographs Maya had never seen of herself torn open, more metal than flesh. "She should be dead," Palmer said quietly. Silence filled the room, not awkward, not defensive, just heavy. For the first time, Maya saw something in Colonel Kine's eyes that wasn't accusation. Shame. But shame alone does not heal. The week that followed had already done damage. He had humiliated her publicly, canceled her appointments, used her case as a warning in formation. 200 soldiers had stood in pre-dawn chill while he spoke about medical abuse, about stealing resources from real wounded warriors. She had stared forward, face blank, heart shattering. Ignored, judged, branded. And now here they were, evidence undeniable. I never believed I should have to parade my wounds to justify care, she said, rebuttoning her shirt with steady hands. Much of Talman Valley remains classified. I followed orders. Kine's voice cracked when he apologized. A real crack, not performance. But apologies don't rewrite culture. The real shift came the next morning, when he asked her to sit. He showed her a photograph, a young officer in dress blues. My son, Lieutenant Daniel Kine. Past tense. Training accident officially, suicide privately. Daniel had come home from Afghanistan with nightmares, anxiety, insomnia. He had tried to speak. His commander had told him to toughen up. Kine had agreed with that philosophy then. Now he buried a son. I became hard so no one would break again, he admitted. Instead, I've been breaking them myself. Maya felt something unfamiliar, empathy for the man who had wounded her. Pain echoes in strange directions. Then stop, she said simply. And he did. 3 weeks later, 53 officers and senior NCOs filled the base theater. Mandatory attendance. Skepticism thick as dust. Colonel Kine opened the session by admitting he was wrong. Then he handed the floor to her. Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table before Talman Valley? Why had she convinced herself that surviving meant staying silent? She told them everything. The explosion, the crawl, the blood, the fragments that still moved when barometric pressure shifted, the migraines that made her bite down on cloth in the bathroom so no one would hear. I hid it, she said, because I was terrified of being called weak. The room changed. Captain James Rivera stood first, admitted he had dismissed a soldier's panic attacks. Major Sarah Chen spoke of 15 years of PTSD. Others followed. 19 out of 53. In the back row, Private Webb cried quietly. Something was shifting. They called it the Invisible Wounds Initiative, training for leadership, expanded medical access, safe reporting channels. It spread across Red Mesa like a cautious sunrise. But systems resist change. Orders came from above. Shut it down, non-essential programming, budget concerns. Brigadier General Lawrence Garrett didn't believe in softness. Kine faced a choice, promotion or principle. He chose principle. The program went underground, coded appointment requests, quiet support networks. And then Corporal Jason Mitchell died. Suicide. 5 words in his note, not strong enough to admit I'm broken. The funeral felt like failure carved in wood. In the chapel afterward, Maya stared at Mitchell's photograph and felt hollow. She had survived Talman Valley, exposed her scars, fought for others. It hadn't been enough. Broken, that was the word echoing now. General Patricia Hawkins arrived days later, theater commander, steel gray hair, eyes that understood war. She had her own invisible wounds from Fallujah, 18 years of nightmares. She expanded the program theater-wide. General Garrett's order was overturned, Kine's promotion approved. And Maya, no longer hiding, was assigned to develop training across installations. Corporal Jason Mitchell's name became a memorial fund for invisible wounds research. Change did not erase loss, it honored it. 18 months later, Maya stood at officer candidate school graduation. Georgia's son pressing against dress blues, second lieutenant now. Brigadier General Marcus Kine watched from the audience. During Week 10 of OCS, she had collapsed on a ruck march. A fragment had migrated dangerously close to a major artery. Surgery followed. Risk high, outcome uncertain. She woke with new scars layered over old. Still here. Still leading. Later, in a quiet office overlooking rows of young recruits, she spoke to a new class of lieutenants. "What does strength look like?" she asked them. No one answered at first. She didn't unbutton her uniform this time. She didn't need to. "It looks like asking for help before silence becomes fatal. It looks like listening when someone whispers instead of waiting for them to scream." Her voice was steady, not angry, not triumphant. Just honest. Because she had learned something Talman Valley could not teach, and humiliation had nearly stolen. Survival is not proof you're unbreakable. It's proof you were given another chance. Outside, training continued, boots in rhythm, orders sharp, discipline intact. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. Soldiers began scheduling appointments without coded language. Leaders attended mental health briefings without eye rolls. Data showed reduced suicides, increased treatment seeking. Imperfect, ongoing, human. One evening, long after most lights had dimmed, Maya stood alone before a mirror. She unbuttoned her shirt slowly. 32 fragments still lived inside her. They always would. She traced the largest scar with her fingertips, not with shame now, not with defiance. With acceptance. She thought of Hunt, Orozco, Vyulov, Mitchell, Daniel Kine. Names carried forward like quiet prayers. Invisible wounds are still wounds. Silence is not strength. And dignity. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand belief. It stands in fluorescent light, unbuttons fear, and tells the truth anyway. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the migraine always come at exactly 03:14, as if her body were replaying a moment it refused to forget? Lieutenant Maya Reeves woke before the alarm just as she always did. The room at Fort Bragg was silent, dark, disciplined. Her breathing was not. It started as pressure behind her right eye, then heat, then the sharp, invasive pulse that felt like a blade pressing from inside her skull. She lay still, counting backward, the way the neurologist had taught her, not because it stopped the pain, but because it gave her something to control. 32 fragments. 32 reasons her nervous system misfired when stress climbed too high. She swung her legs over the side of the bed carefully. Sudden movements were dangerous now, not just because of dizziness, but because one fragment rested less than a centimeter from her subclavian artery. The surgeons at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center had warned her plainly. Another shift like that, and you won't have time to reach the floor. She had signed the risk acknowledgement without hesitation. Now, alone in the dark, hesitation crept in. Not fear of dying. Fear of failing before the mission was complete. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and breathed through the wave. Sweat gathered along her spine. The pain peaked, then plateaued, merciful but cruelly persistent. Ignored. That had been her strategy for years. Ignore it, outwork it, outperform it. But pain is patient. It waits for quiet moments to remind you who is really in control. By 600 hours, she was in uniform, crisp dress fatigues, boots mirror-polished, posture perfect. No one in the operations building would see the tremor that had passed through her hands 30 minutes earlier. Major Sarah Chen did. "You're pale," Chen said softly as they reviewed briefing packets. "I'm hydrated," Maya replied too quickly. Chen didn't push. She understood the line between support and intrusion. She had walked her own years of invisible wounds, 15 of them, before finally admitting that fireworks made her hands shake and diesel fumes pulled her back to Iraq. The Invisible Wounds initiative had been expanding for 6 months now. 15 installations, over 3,000 enrolled service members. Data was promising. But resistance still lived in corners. That morning's briefing was with a visiting assessment team, senior officers evaluating whether the program justified long-term funding. Translation: whether soldiers' pain fit into a spreadsheet. As they entered the conference room, Maya felt the migraine spike again. Fluorescent lights flickered just slightly, enough to trigger a sharp flare behind her eye. "Stay steady." She placed her binder on the table, hands flat against the cool surface. Across from her sat Colonel Bryce Hammond, career infantry, combat veteran, reputation for being old school. He scanned the program summary with a faint crease between his brows. "I'll be blunt, Lieutenant," Hammond said. "I respect what you survived. Talman Valley was hell, but the Army has always demanded resilience. How do we ensure this doesn't turn into an excuse culture?" There it was again. Excuse. The word slid under her skin like shrapnel. She felt anxiety rise, not because she doubted her answers, but because she knew this wasn't just about data. It was about identity, about what kind of soldier they believed they were allowed to be. "Sir," she began evenly, "resilience and treatment aren't opposites. They're partners. When we ignore injuries, visible or invisible, performance degrades, quietly at first, then catastrophically." Hammond leaned back. "Numbers." She gave them. Reduced suicide rates in participating units, improved retention percentages, measurable increase in deployment readiness scores, fewer disciplinary incidents linked to untreated trauma. He nodded slightly, but skepticism lingered. Then he asked the question that caught her off guard. "And you, Lieutenant, how often are you on limited duty?" The room stilled. There was no malice in his tone, just curiosity, but it landed heavily. She could lie, say rarely, say under control. Instead, she chose honesty. "I monitor symptoms daily, sir. I've undergone 2 surgical interventions since Talman Valley. I manage chronic nerve pain and migraines. I meet standards through modified conditioning approved by medical command." Hammond studied her face carefully. "And if your condition worsens?" There it was, the question she asked herself in the dark. "If it worsens, who am I without the uniform?" The answer terrified her more than the possibility of bleeding out. "I will adapt," she said quietly, "but I will not pretend I'm invincible." For a long moment, Hammond said nothing. Then he surprised her. "My last deployment," he said slowly, "my executive officer started drinking heavily. High performer. Never missed a mission. We found out later he'd been having panic attacks in the Humvee before patrols. He hid it because he didn't want to be labeled." He closed the folder. "I wrote his letter to his wife after he rolled his vehicle at 90 miles per hour." The air shifted. "This program might have given him a different outcome," Hammond admitted. Maya felt something loosen inside her chest. Not victory, just recognition. After the meeting, Chen caught her alone near the stairwell. "You almost passed out in there," Chen said quietly. "I didn't." "You swayed." Maya exhaled slowly. The migraine had dulled to a low hum now, dangerous in a different way. Dull pain encouraged overconfidence. "I can handle it," Maya insisted. Chen's eyes softened, not pitying, protective. "You don't have to prove strength every minute of every day." Maya looked away. That was the problem. She felt like she did. Later that afternoon, she visited the peer support group led by Sergeant Marcus Webb. Once the 19-year-old private she'd trained on encryption protocols, now steady, confident, grounded. He greeted her with a firm handshake and a quiet smile. "You look tired, ma'am." "Flattering as always, Sergeant." He laughed lightly, then grew serious. New guy joined today. Staff Sergeant Tours, 2 deployments. Says he doesn't need therapy, just wants to stop punching walls. Maya nodded slowly. Progress wasn't linear, it was messy, resistant, human. She sat in the back during the session, listening as Tours described insomnia, hypervigilance, anger that flared without warning. "I don't want to be weak," Tours muttered at one point. Webb responded calmly. "Neither did I. Turns out talking didn't make me weaker. It made me deployable." Maya watched the shift in Tours' expression, the subtle easing when he realized he wasn't alone. Hope, fragile, earned. That night, alone in her quarters, the migraine returned stronger. She sank to the edge of her bed, fingers pressing into her temple. Anxious now. The fragment near her artery had been stable for weeks, but stress accumulated like pressure in a sealed container. She reached for her phone and hesitated before dialing. Dr. Palmer answered on the second ring. "You don't call at night unless it's bad," Palmer said immediately. "It's manageable," Maya replied. "Define manageable." She closed her eyes. "It feels like Talman Valley is knocking from inside my skull." Silence on the other end. "Come in tomorrow," Palmer said gently. "Scan, no debate." Maya almost argued. Almost said she had briefings. Almost said she couldn't afford downtime. Instead, she surprised herself. Okay. It felt small. But it was. The next morning at the medical imaging suite, she lay still while the machine hummed around her. The ceiling above blurred slightly as the migraine pulsed. Ignored. For years she'd ignored it. Now she was learning something harder. To listen. Palmer reviewed the images quietly. "There's minimal migration," she said finally. "But inflammation is higher, you're pushing too hard." "I'm fine," Maya whispered automatically. Palmer gave her a look that carried history. "You don't have to earn oxygen, Maya." The word struck deeper than expected. Earn oxygen. Earn rest. Earn care. Was that what she'd been doing all along? Proving she deserved to stay alive. She swallowed hard. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly. "Of dying." "No." She stared at the CT image of metal, lodged near a pulsing vessel. "I'm afraid of becoming irrelevant." Palmer's voice softened. "You survived an explosion most wouldn't. You changed policy across installations. You gave soldiers permission to speak. You are not relevant because you endure pain. You're relevant because you choose honesty." The honesty hurt, but it also steadied her. That evening she stood again before her mirror, slowly unbuttoned her shirt. The scars looked different now, not accusations, not armor. Evidence. Evidence of endurance, of cost, of choice. She traced one lightly. "I'm still here," she whispered. Not as a challenge. As gratitude. Outside, the base carried on. Engines roared, boots struck pavement, orders echoed through corridors. Warriors trained. And quietly, invisibly, some of them scheduled appointments without shame. Some admitted they were struggling. Some chose not to suffer alone. Maya pulled her shirt closed and fastened each button carefully. Strength wasn't about pretending fragments didn't hurt. It was about standing anyway. And sometimes, it was about sitting down before you collapsed. Why did the phone start ringing at 02:17 in the morning? And why did Maya already know it wasn't good news? She was awake before the second vibration. Pain did that to her. It kept her hovering between sleep and alertness, as if her body no longer trusted silence. The migraine hadn't fully left since the scan 2 days ago. It lingered like a warning flare behind her eyes. She reached for the phone on the nightstand. Lieutenant Reeves. It was Sergeant Webb. His voice was controlled, too controlled. Ma'am, it's Tors. Her chest tightened instantly. What happened? He tried to take his own life tonight. Overdose. His roommate found him in time. He's alive. He's at Womack. The air left her lungs in a slow, quiet exhale. Alive. But barely. I'm on my way, she said. The hospital corridor lights felt harsher than usual. Or maybe it was just the migraine amplifying everything. The antiseptic smell hit her with a wave of memory, diesel and blood layered over it like a ghost she could never quite shake. She found Webb outside the observation room. He looked younger than his rank for the first time in years. I thought we were getting through to him, Webb said, voice low. He came to group. He talked, I thought. You didn't fail him, Maya said gently. But she felt the old anxiety creeping in. Had they missed something, had she? Inside the room, Staff Sergeant Tors lay pale against white sheets, IV line taped to his arm, monitor beeping steadily. Alive, fragile. Maya stepped closer. He looked smaller without his uniform. Ignored. That word again. How many times had he swallowed what he wanted to say because the culture had taught him pain was weakness? Even now, in recovery, would shame drown gratitude? She stood beside his bed for a long moment. You're still here, she whispered quietly, more to herself than to him. Webb watched her carefully. He kept saying he didn't want to disappoint his team, Webb said. Said leaders don't crack. Maya's jaw tightened. Leaders don't crack. She thought of Colonel Kine in his office months ago. The certainty in his voice when he had called her injuries excuses. The shame in his eyes when he learned the truth. She thought of Daniel Kine. Leaders don't crack. They just break privately. Tors stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering, confusion first, then recognition. Ma'am, his voice was hoarse. I'm here, she said softly. He swallowed hard. I messed up. No, she said firmly, you survived. His eyes glossed over. I didn't want them to see me like this. Maya leaned closer. They already see you as strong. Strength isn't pretending you're fine. It's staying alive long enough to get help. He turned his face away, shame heavy in the motion. She understood that shame too well. Later in the hospital cafeteria, she sat with Webb and Chen. Coffee sat untouched between them. Chen broke the silence first. This is exactly why we fight resistance, she said quietly. Exactly why the program can't slow down. Maya nodded, but her hands trembled slightly around the cup. The migraine was pulsing again, sharper now. Webb noticed. You need to sit, he said. I am sitting. He didn't smile. No, ma'am, you need to actually sit. There it was, the shift. Once she had been the one carrying everyone. Now others were learning to carry her. The vulnerability unsettled her more than the pain. Back at her quarters, she didn't take off her boots immediately. She stood by the window instead, staring out at the dim base lights. The weight of Tor's pale face lingered in her mind. Broken. He had thought he was broken. She had thought the same after Talman Valley, though she never said it aloud. The difference between surviving and living was razor thin sometimes. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Brigadier General Kine. Call me when you're able. She hesitated before dialing. He answered immediately. I heard, he said. He's alive. Thank God. Silence stretched between them. You did everything right, Kine added. Did I? Her voice surprised her with its edge. There was a pause. You can't outrun every consequence of culture overnight, he said carefully. Change moves slower than pain. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. I keep thinking if I had spoken sooner years ago, if I hadn't hidden. You survived how you needed to survive, he interrupted gently. And now you're helping others survive differently. She closed her eyes. For a long moment, she allowed herself to feel something she rarely admitted. Tired. Not just physically. Spirit tired. I don't know how long I can keep pushing at this pace, she confessed quietly. On the other end, she heard him exhale. Then don't, he said. The simplicity of it startled her. I can't step back, she insisted automatically. There's too much at stake. There will always be something at stake, he replied. Your life isn't collateral for this mission. The words struck deeper than he probably realized. Her life had always felt like borrowed time since Talman Valley, as if surviving meant she owed something constant in return. Daniel thought he had to carry everything alone, Kind said softly. I won't watch another soldier do the same, not even you. The line went quiet. She didn't realize tears had slipped down until one reached her jaw. I'm not quitting, she said. I'm not asking you to, he replied. I'm asking you to lead sustainably. Sustainably. The word felt foreign. War had never been sustainable. Survival wasn't sustainable. But maybe leadership could be. The next morning she visited Tors again. He was more alert. Embarrassment still shadowed his expression, but there was something else too. Relief. I thought I was going to die, he admitted quietly. Sometimes we have to get close to that edge to realize we don't actually want to fall, she said. He studied her carefully. Does it ever stop hurting? He asked. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. No, she answered honestly, but you learn how to carry it differently. He nodded slowly. I don't want to hide anymore. Her chest tightened. Then don't, she said. Later that week, Maya addressed a small group of junior officers newly assigned to the installation. It wasn't a formal training session, just a conversation. She stood without notes. I want you to understand something, she began. Leadership isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being responsible with your fractures. They listened closely. You set the emotional temperature of your units. If you treat mental health as weakness, they'll bury their wounds until they explode. If you treat it as maintenance, they'll stay mission capable. One young lieutenant raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you know when you've pushed too far? The question lingered in the air. She considered it carefully. When the mission starts costing more lives in silence than it would by pausing to repair, she said. After the session, she returned to her office and closed the door quietly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sit without working. The migraine was faint today, manageable. She pressed her palm lightly over her chest. 32 fragments. Still there. Still a risk. But she wasn't fighting them alone anymore. Outside, soldiers moved across the base in steady rhythm. Somewhere in the hospital, Tors was speaking with a therapist without whispering. Somewhere in another installation, a commander was rethinking a dismissive comment. Progress was quiet, invisible, but real. Maya leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She had survived Talman Valley. She had survived humiliation. She had survived watching Chain resist her efforts. Now she was learning something new. She didn't have to survive alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was the strongest kind of leadership there was. Why did the email subject line feel heavier than any battlefield report she had ever opened? Maya stared at the screen for a long moment before clicking it. Department of the Army, Medical Review Board notification. Her pulse slowed instead of quickening. That was how she knew it mattered. Real danger didn't spike her heart anymore. It quieted it. She opened the message. Further evaluation required. Recommendation for potential reclassification pending neurological assessment. Temporary restriction from field deployment status. The words were clinical, detached, efficient. But between the lines, she read something else. Step back. or be stepped aside. She leaned back in her chair slowly, careful not to move too fast. The migraine had been merciful this week, almost gentle, as if her body were trying to negotiate peace. Ignored. For years she had ignored warning signs. Now the institution was refusing to. A knock came at her door. "Ma'am," Webb's voice. "Come in." He stepped inside, carrying a folder, then paused when he saw her expression. "What happened?" She turned the monitor toward him. He read quickly, his jaw tightened. "They can't just pull you," he said. "They can," she replied calmly, "and maybe they should." The word surprised even her. Webb stared. "You built this program." "It was never supposed to depend on me," she said quietly. But beneath the composure, something fragile stirred. If she wasn't deployable, was she still a soldier? Webb sat down across from her without asking permission, something he would never have done 2 years ago. "You told Tor's strength is staying alive long enough to get help," he said. "You told me resilience isn't denial." She gave him a faint look. "Are you using my own speeches against me?" "Yes, ma'am." Despite herself, she almost smiled. But the anxiety remained. Reclassification meant uncertainty. It meant paperwork. It meant whispers in hallways. It meant some would quietly say, "See, she couldn't keep up." And the old voice inside her, the one shaped by fire and shrapnel, whispered something harsher. "You're becoming exactly what they feared. A liability." That afternoon, she sat in the neurologist's office again. Dr. Palmer reviewed the latest scans with steady professionalism. "The fragment near your subclavian artery has shifted slightly," Palmer said. "Still not surgical, but inflammation markers are elevated." Maya nodded. "I've reduced high-intensity training," she said. "I know," Palmer replied, "but stress isn't just physical." Maya looked at the image on the screen, the small bright flecks scattered like stars inside darkness. Talman Valley lived inside her skull. "What are you recommending?" Maya asked. "A 6-month non-deployable status, continued leadership role, reduced operational tempo." 6 months. In military time, that was an eternity. "And if I refuse?" Palmer didn't flinch. "Then you risk a hemorrhage that won't give you a second warning." Silence filled the room. For years she had outrun consequences. But outrunning wasn't the same as healing. "I'll comply," she said finally. The word tasted unfamiliar. Comply. On her walk back across base, the sky felt wider than usual. Late afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the pavement. Soldiers jogged past her in formation, boots striking in unison. She used to lead those runs. Her chest tightened unexpectedly, not from pain but from memory. Proud. She had been proud of how hard she could push, proud of endurance, proud of outlasting doubt. Now she was being asked to redefine pride. Inside headquarters, whispers traveled faster than official memos. By evening, several officers had already heard about the review board. Some offered quiet encouragement. Others offered silence. Colonel Hammond requested to see her before the day ended. She entered his office with steady posture. "At ease, Lieutenant," he said. She remained standing anyway. "I read the board notification," he continued. "I want you to know this does not diminish your credibility. With respect, sir, perception doesn't always follow policy." He studied her carefully. "You think I see you differently?" She hesitated. "I think some will." Hammond leaned forward. "I lost 2 soldiers because they were too proud to step back from concussions. They cleared themselves for patrol. Both suffered catastrophic brain injuries after secondary blasts." The weight in his voice was unmistakable. "You stepping back temporarily may save more lives than you pushing through," he said. She absorbed that quietly. "You're not a liability," he added. "You're an example." Example. The word both comforted and burdened her. That night, alone again, she sat on the edge of her bed, uniform jacket folded neatly beside her. The room was dim, quiet. Broken. That was the word she feared most. Not injured. Not recovering. Broken implied something beyond repair. She pressed her fingers lightly against the scar beneath her collarbone. The explosion hadn't broken her. The surgeries hadn't broken her. Why did stepping back feel like it might? Her phone buzzed again. A text from Tors. "Started therapy today, didn't run." She stared at it. Didn't run. Neither had she. She typed back slowly. "Proud of you, one step at a time." After sending it, she realized something. 6 months ago, Tors would have hidden that appointment. 6 months ago, she would have hidden this review board. Change was happening. Not loudly, but steadily. The next morning, she gathered her core leadership team. Chen, Webb, 2 captains, a civilian counselor. She didn't soften it. "I've been placed on temporary non-deployable status pending further neurological evaluation," she said evenly. "I will remain in command of the initiative, but I will be delegating more field operations." Silence settled over the room. Then Chen spoke. "Good." Maya blinked. "Good," she repeated. "Yes," Chen said firmly. "You tell soldiers to protect their longevity. Now you are." Webb nodded. "You staying alive matters more than optics." The simplicity of it hit her hard. Staying alive. It shouldn't be controversial. Yet in this culture, sometimes it was. "I need you all to understand something," she continued quietly. "This program cannot hinge on one personality. It must be systemic." "It already is," Webb said. She looked around the room. For the first time since the email, the anxiety eased slightly. They weren't waiting for her to collapse. They were ready to carry weight too. Later that day, she walked past the physical training field again. Instead of joining the formation, she stopped at the edge. One of the younger soldiers noticed her watching. "Ma'am, you coming in?" he called lightly. She paused. Old instinct urged her forward. "Prove it. Push. Outlast." Instead, she shook her head gently. "Not today," she said. There was no shame in her voice. Only steadiness. She turned and walked back toward headquarters, sunlight warm against her shoulders. For the first time since Talman Valley, she wasn't measuring her worth by how much pain she could endure. She was measuring it by how wisely she could lead. 6 months. It wasn't exile. It was recalibration. Inside her office, she sat down slowly and opened a blank document. Not a report. Not a defense. A plan. How to transition leadership sustainably. How to expand peer networks. How to embed mental health officers at unit level without stigma. The work continued. Her identity shifted, not from warrior to patient, but from solitary survivor to architect of resilience. Outside, the base hummed as it always had. Missions would deploy. Soldiers would train. The machine would move. And she would remain, not at the front of the formation for now, but at its spine. Sometimes strength roars. Sometimes it kneels. And sometimes strength signs the paper that keeps it breathing. Why did the silence after stepping back feel louder than any explosion she had survived? 6 weeks into her non-deployable status, the base had adjusted to her absence from field operations faster than she had. Formations ran without her. Training exercises unfolded on schedule. Briefings carried on. The machine did not pause. She told herself that was a good thing. Still, each morning when reveille echoed across the installation, her chest tightened with something she refused to name at first. Not jealousy, not regret, displacement. Her boots were still polished, her uniform still crisp, but her days no longer began with weapons checks or field reports. They began with meetings, strategic planning sessions, therapy coordination calls. Important work, but quieter, and quiet had always been dangerous for her. She sat in her office reviewing expansion metrics for the initiative when a sharp flare of pain cut through her vision. It wasn't a full migraine, just a warning pulse, a reminder that her body still dictated terms. She closed her eyes. Breathe in, count, breathe out. 32 fragments. 32 reasons to move deliberately. A knock came. "Ma'am," Chen said softly, stepping inside. "You look like you're negotiating with your skull again." Maya gave a faint half-smile. "It's a stubborn opponent." Chen leaned against the doorframe. "You've been pushing too hard on administrative load." "I'm not lifting artillery," Maya replied lightly. "Stress weighs the same," Chen said. The words lingered. Stress weighs the same. Maya had always equated worth with visible exertion, sweat, exhaustion, physical strain. Now she was learning that invisible strain could be heavier. That afternoon, she attended a command roundtable on soldier readiness. Senior officers debated resource allocation, deployment cycles, retention numbers. At one point, a visiting commander from another installation spoke dismissively. "We can't afford to overcorrect," he said. "If every stress reaction becomes medicalized, readiness drops." The room went quiet. Old instinct flared in her, the urge to challenge sharply, to prove. Instead, she chose steadiness. "Respectfully, sir," she said calmly, "untreated stress reactions already drop readiness. They just do it quietly." He met her gaze. "You're suggesting vulnerability improves combat effectiveness." "I'm suggesting reality does," she replied. There was no edge in her tone, just clarity. A few heads nodded. The conversation shifted. Afterward, Hammond caught up with her in the hallway. "You handled that differently than you would have 6 months ago," he observed. "How so?" "Less fire, more gravity." She absorbed that. Fire had fueled her for years, anger at dismissal, anger at stigma, anger at nearly dying. Gravity felt different. Slower. Grounded. That evening, she visited Tours again, not in the hospital this time, but at the small on-base cafe where he now met weekly with other soldiers from the support group. He looked stronger, still quiet but present. "Ma'am," he greeted her, standing instinctively. "At ease," she said gently, sitting across from him. He hesitated before speaking. "I almost quit the army," he admitted, "after everything." She nodded. "What stopped you?" He looked down at his coffee. "You did." The simplicity of it unsettled her. "I wasn't in that room," she said. "You didn't have to be," he replied. "You stood up publicly after Talman Valley, after being called a liar. You didn't hide your scars." She swallowed. "Scars. Physical and otherwise." "I didn't feel brave," she admitted quietly. He gave a small, knowing smile. "Neither did I when I asked for help." They sat in silence for a moment. Hope. It was fragile, but it was real. Later that night, back in her quarters, she pulled out the small wooden box she rarely opened. Inside were fragments of a different life. Her old sniper qualification badge, slightly bent from impact, a folded photograph from her first deployment, a medal citation from Talman Valley. And beneath them, the news clipping. Female operative, excuse exposed as war injury. She remembered the press cycle, the humiliation, The way General Kine had publicly questioned her integrity before learning the truth. She had forgiven him, eventually, but the moment had carved something deep inside her. Ignored, dismissed, doubted. Those wounds had taken longer to heal than the shrapnel. She traced the edge of the clipping. What if stepping back now felt threatening because it echoed that moment? Because part of her still feared being seen as less. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Dr. Palmer. Inflammation levels improving. Keep packing yourself. She stared at the words. Improving. Not cured, but improving. There was something quietly powerful about gradual healing. The next week brought unexpected news. The Army approved expanded funding for the Invisible Wounds Initiative. 5 additional installations, dedicated staffing, permanent integration into readiness protocols. Maya read the memo twice. 6 months ago, she had fought just to keep the program alive. Now it was institutional. She walked into the main conference room where her team had gathered. "It's approved," she said simply. For a second, no one reacted, as if they didn't trust good news. Then Webb let out a low whistle. "Ma'am, you did it." She shook her head. "We did." But inside something shifted. Pride. Not the old kind, rooted in endurance. This was quieter, rooted in impact. Later, alone in her office, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She wasn't deploying. She wasn't clearing buildings or calculating wind drift through a scope. But soldiers across multiple bases would now have access to care without whispering. That mattered. Her career might look different than she once imagined. But different didn't mean diminished. As evening settled, she stepped outside headquarters. The sky was streaked with orange and deep blue. A training unit marched past, cadence steady. One of the younger soldiers glanced her way and nodded respectfully. She returned the nod. She no longer needed to outrun them to feel worthy. The migraine that had threatened earlier never fully formed. She breathed deeply. 32 fragments. Still there, but no longer the center of her identity. Weeks later, during a routine follow-up scan, Dr. Palmer studied the images and smiled faintly. "Inflammation is significantly reduced," she said. "No further migration." Maya exhaled slowly. "So I'm not falling apart," she murmured. "You were never falling apart," Palmer corrected gently. "You were healing." Healing. The word felt foreign for so long. Now it felt possible. That night, Maya returned to her quarters and stood before the mirror again. She unbuttoned her shirt slowly, revealing the constellation of scars across her torso. They were still jagged, still imperfect, but they no longer felt like accusations. They felt like chapters. She ran her fingers lightly over one near her collarbone, the one closest to the artery. So much had hinged on millimeters. So much still did. She fastened her shirt carefully and looked at her reflection. Not broken. Not invincible. Becoming. Outside, the base continued its rhythm. Engines humming, boots striking pavement, distant laughter drifting from the barracks. Life moved forward. And so did she. Strength, she was learning, wasn't about proving you could carry everything alone. It was about knowing when to set the weight down and trusting that others would help lift it. Sometimes survival isn't the loudest victory. Sometimes it's simply choosing to stay and letting yourself heal. What happens when the war inside you finally grows quiet and you're left alone with who you've become? 6 months passed faster than she expected. Not because they were easy, but because they were deliberate. Maya stood outside the medical review board room again, hands relaxed at her sides. No tremor now, no sharp migraine drilling behind her eyes, just a steady pulse and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She had imagined this moment differently once. She thought she would feel desperate to be cleared, restless, proving. Instead, she felt measured. Dr. Palmer stepped out first, offering a small nod. Inflammation stabilized. No migration. Neurological response consistent. I'm recommending limited deployable status with operational discretion. Limited. A word that once would have pierced her pride. Now it felt precise, responsible. Inside the room, the board members reviewed her file, mission history, medical reports, leadership evaluations, the expansion success of the initiative. Colonel Hammond looked up from the paperwork. "Lieutenant Reeves," he said, "if reinstated to field operations, would you pursue full combat deployment?" The old Maya would have answered immediately. "Yes, sir." Without hesitation. Without doubt. She took a breath instead. "I would pursue assignments where my experience provides value without compromising long-term readiness," she replied evenly. A subtle shift. Not prove myself. Provide value. Hammond held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. That's the answer of someone who understands command. When she stepped out into the sunlight afterward, the air felt different, not lighter, just clearer. She wasn't returning to who she had been before Talman Valley. She wasn't trying to. That version of her had believed endurance alone defined strength. This version knew better. Weeks later, she stood on a quiet training range at dawn, not as the lead sniper, not as the relentless operative chasing perfection. She was there as an instructor. A small group of soldiers gathered around, rifles grounded safely, eyes attentive. "Wind doesn't care about your ego," she told them calmly. "Neither does gravity. Control what you can, accept what you can't." One of the younger soldiers asked, "Ma'am, how do you stay steady when everything's loud?" The question wasn't just about shooting. She knew that. "You breathe," she said softly, "and you stop pretending the noise isn't there." They listened carefully. She demonstrated stance adjustments, sight corrections, breathing rhythm. Her movements were slower than years ago, more deliberate, but they were precise. Gravity, not fire. After the session, as the soldiers dispersed, Torres approached. He'd returned to full duty months ago, steadier, more grounded. "Didn't think I'd see you back out here," he admitted. "I didn't either," she replied honestly. He studied her expression. "You good?" She considered the question. "Not invincible. Not fearless. But good." "I'm learning," she said. He smiled. "Me too." That afternoon, she met Brigadier General Kine for coffee, a quiet corner of the base cafe that had become neutral ground over the months. "You look different," he observed. "Older," she teased lightly. "Settled," he corrected. She thought about that. For years, she had been braced for impact, physically and emotionally. Even after the explosion, she lived as if another blast might come at any second. Now the constant brace was easing. "I used to think surviving meant I owed something every day," she admitted, "like I had to justify still being here." Kine nodded slowly. "Daniel thought that too," he said quietly. They sat with that shared understanding. "You don't owe survival anything," he added. "It's not a debt, it's a gift." A gift. The word landed gently. She had never framed it that way. Later that evening, she walked alone across the base as the sun dipped below the horizon. Cadence calls echoed faintly in the distance. Engines rumbled. Laughter drifted from somewhere near the barracks. Life. Ordinary, unremarkable, precious. Her phone buzzed, a message from Chen. "New installation integrated. Zero resistance so far." Maya smiled softly. The initiative no longer needed her voice at every table. It had grown roots. She paused near the memorial wall at the edge of the parade ground, names etched into polished stone, lives condensed into letters. Talman Valley had almost added hers. She traced the edge of the wall lightly. Ignored, mocked, doubted. Those moments had once defined her anger. Now they felt like chapters that shaped her clarity. General Kine's public apology months ago had not erased the humiliation, but it had marked something important: accountability. And she had learned something deeper than vindication. Dignity doesn't need applause. It needs alignment with truth. As darkness settled, she felt a faint flicker of pressure behind her eye, not pain, just awareness. 32 fragments. Still part of her story, but no longer her enemy. Back in her quarters, she stood before the mirror one final time that night. She unbuttoned her shirt slowly, revealing the scars that had once felt like accusations. They were still there. They would always be there. She touched the one near her collarbone, the millimeter that could have ended everything. So much almost, she whispered. Almost dead. Almost silenced. Almost dismissed. But not. She buttoned her shirt carefully and looked at her reflection. Not the same woman who had stood alone at that briefing table years ago, while a general called her a liar. Not the same soldier who believed pain had to be hidden to be respected. She was steadier now, quieter, whole in a way that didn't require perfection. Outside, the base lights flickered on one by one. Soldiers prepared for tomorrow's drills. Somewhere, someone scheduled their first therapy appointment without shame. Somewhere else, a commander chose his words more carefully. Change rarely announces itself. It accumulates. Maya stepped to the window and watched the night settle. She could deploy again selectively, wisely. She could teach. She could lead. She could rest. All without apologizing for the fragments inside her. For years, she had believed strength meant absorbing impact without flinching. Now she understood something deeper. Strength is telling the truth about the impact and standing anyway. Sometimes, the loudest battles leave the quietest scars. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.